Okay, that says we're live. And hello, this is Tom Burkhalter with Malcolm Kelly here for Books Go Social. Malcolm, how are you today?
I'm doing very well today, Tom. Thank you very much for having me on all the way from the Carolinas.
Well, it's our pleasure. You are the author of at least one book, right? Called, yeah, Sprague, a novel of Bomber Command. Why
Yeah.
don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is my fifth book. It's my first novel.
Okay.
I'm a sports writer by trade, so I have four nonfiction sports books that came out. Sprague is a British word, which means infant or rookie or newcomer or baby. And for an example, if I were to see a pregnant woman in England, I would walk up and say, "Good morning, and how's the little Sprague this morning?" But it was the name that was given to rookie airmen and rookie air crews during the war. When you joined up in the RAF or the RCAF or the Royal Australian Air Force as examples, and you to learn to fly, when you first got there, you were a rookie, you were Sprague airman. And then each time when you moved up a level in you became a Sprague something until you got to operation. And for the first five missions, you were known, the rookie crews are known as Sprague air crews. But the book, this is the first in what we're hoping will be five books, but the book captures a specific moment. Captures a moment in 1941 in Canada, for me specifically in Southern Ontario, where kids were coming out of high school and joining the Royal Canadian Air Force to learn to fly in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And kids were coming from everywhere. They were coming from Canada, from all over the Commonwealth. There were 10,000 Americans who came north to join the BCATP and learn to fly before Pearl Harbor, including 900 Texans. There were so many Texans that they referred to themselves as the Royal Texas Air Force. And what Sprague does is it brings them all together and takes them through their training in the BCATP, through basic, through initial, through elementary, through service trying, which was advanced. But that's just the narrative thread.
Mm-hmm.
What the book is also about, it's about who they were. It's about their songs, their films, their music, who they were as people, their pop culture, how they spoke to each other, which is one of the reasons why it took 15 years. And so it's very much a human story where the training is the thread of how we tell this human story. And
Well,
the thing I was trying to do, sorry to interrupt, but the thing I was trying to do is the first book captures them before they go to war. So it captures them before so many, Tom, are going to become names on a cenotaph. It
mm-hmm.
captures them before so many others, like my father, who was in the army, are going to come home changed forever. I wanted people to know who their grandfathers and their fathers, their great uncles and things were before this happened to them, when they
Yeah,
were still kids.
yeah. Well, I think that's a noble endeavor, and that leads right into another question I'd like to ask. You did a lot of interviews with veterans, I assume, over
Mhm.
that period of time.
Mhm.
So, and I would assume that was very important in your work. What particularly did you draw from it?
Well, I've been an aviation historian for most of my life, as an amateur.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got into this, I started to interview a lot of former airmen, and of course, there's a ton of research and books and all of the background material and that sort of thing. But it was the interviewing of the airmen that you start to really get to understand what's going on. My main mentor on this book, and I had four big mentors on this book. All of them are gone now. Through the
Mm-hmm.
15 years, I was losing them as we going along.
Sure.
My main mentor on this book is a guy named Bob Middleton, and Flying Officer Bob Middleton. And Bob was a navigator on Halifax's and Lancaster's during the war. He flew 33 missions,
Mm-hmm.
23 in Lancs, 10 on Halifax. Is out of 431 Squadron, which is in very North Yorkshire.
Yeah.
at a place called Croft. And Bob liked to call himself a nosy navigator. But we had, because he just could not stop himself from going up and looking out when they were over the target. Some navigators just stayed there and didn't go anywhere near looking out. They just navigated. But Bob wanted to know everything about everything. And he was a brilliant navigator. And so he kept me on the straight and narrow for a lot of this stuff. And it was big. I would get phone calls at 7 in the morning from Bob. Hi, this is Bob. Hi, Bob. How are you? Okay, we got to fix this section here. And okay, Bob. And we would get it fixed. And you just did not argue. And I'll tell you a story. In Sprague Book 2, which is 75% finished, which Bob was so helpful on. Their first raid is the raid on Duisburg, and it's in April of 1943 from Middleton St. George in a 6th group. It's the most furthest north,
Right.
The furthest north airfield. And so when you're doing this, you use the actual raid. You don't try to invent stuff. You put your characters into this raid.
Right.
And so I was checking all of the turning points, all the checkpoints and the times. And Croft and Middleton St. George had what was called what was called the large landing pattern, because they were right across the river from each other. They only had one landing pattern, right? And so he knew. And so I send him off. I get a call, and then he goes, you're 2 minutes late on this over the target. I went, what? He said, you're 2 minutes late over the target. I said, well, he said, look, I'm telling you that the amount of time it took you with the winds and the height you're at and the aircraft you were flying, which is a Halifax B Mark 1 Special. He said, when you make that turn and you're going to the target, you arrive at the target 2 minutes late. You need to fix that. And I got mad, and I thought, so I went and checked and double checked it. You know what? Damn it. We were 2 minutes late over the target. And he did it off the top of his head, right? When he was in his mid-90s. It's just incredible, So that's how you do these things,
Talking to those old guys is just, it's beyond education, and it's a shame,
especially if they're still sharp.
Yeah. Because I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to a few of them like that, not to the extent that you did, and I envy you that, because I think it's just irreplaceable. Now the gist of this interview is doing historical fiction, and of course, if anybody wants to do World War II fiction now, as far as live interviews like that, they're almost out of luck. I don't know of any locally that are still around, for example.
But I think that there's still a market for it, because and I hope that I've done so in Sprague, and we are running at 60% 5-star on Amazon and 94% positive reviews. But I think that I think there's lots of room for it, because we're talking literally here in the RAF and, say, the United States Army Air Corps / Army Air Forces, we're talking literally 300,000 airmen.
Sure.
And each one had a story, right? So there's still room to tell these stories, as long as you can come up with something that's a little different, or creative. And so I would never, somebody came to me and said, I'd like to write a piece of World War II fiction. I'd say, let's go. Just make sure that you write it about your characters, and you make sure that you do your research properly.
Yeah.
And there's 2 different ways to do that. And we actually, in our pre-interview, we were talking about the different styles, and about how Len Dayton in Bomber chose to make everything fictional, including the day, June 31st, 1943, and with a fictional group and a fictional squadron and all the rest of that stuff. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can do it that way, or you can take the extra work that's needed to fit your fictional aircrew, or in my case, 2 aircrews, when we get to book 2, but to fit all of these fictional characters into the actual events that happened. So that so that, and then what that means is that you are it's not trapped, but you have a responsibility to make sure that you follow the story the way the story went while melding your characters in. You can't be inventing things for the characters to do or have happen to them if they never happened.
Right.
And that's where the responsibility comes in.
So really what you're talking about is it's almost like you're shooting a movie in the fuselage of the airplane.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it metaphorically, because when you're doing it that way, if you're trapped, if you're sort of held into the fuselage of the plane, you can't have them jump out of the move away from the fuselage. You have to
Right.
keep them in the story arc that is created by the actual events.
Right.
So when my characters, and for your American folks, you would just love my character from Abilene, Texas. He is Claiborne Barry Taylor, and he graduates from Abilene High School, plays football for Dewey Mayhew,
Mm-hmm.
who was the legendary football coach at Abilene, does a year at the University of Texas, wants to go fly. They won't let him because he doesn't have 2 years of college in.
Right.
This is 1940.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
so he goes to join the RCAF, which is one of the big reasons why so many Americans joined the RCAF, because they wanted to go now, not wait.
Mm-hmm.
And but he's just a great character, and but you take his character and you move him through things that actually happened. So you take him up to Detroit, and you take him across the bridge, the Ambassador Bridge, into Windsor. You sign him up. You send him off to #1 Manning School, which is basic training here in Toronto. But you stick with that. But once you do that, you can have that character be anybody you want it to be. And he's my favorite character. He's wonderful character. He's just he is smart as all hell, super high IQ, but likes to tease the Canadians because he and his friends coming up from Texas are basically the first Texans that they've ever met. So their view, right? So their view of Texans, so their idea of what a Texan is what they've seen by watching cowboy movies
Sure.
in the 1930s, right? And so that's what they think a Texan is. So rather than sort of say rather than saying to them, his best friend turns out to be a guy from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but rather than say to them, oh, well, no, that's not what us Texans are like. He decided, okay, I'm going to have some fun here. So he drags out every Texas idiom that he can drag out, and he's just having the best of time with them, and they get him back because he says, I should be giving this away, but what the hell? He says to one of the Canadians that it's the winter, and he says, listen, I'm told that one of the guys over there told me that if you stick your tongue against a metal object outside when it's cold, the tongue will stick to it. And all the Canadians, all of his Canadian guys, all Canadian buddies, no, that's not true. Come on, that would never be true. Go on out and try it. Come on. But that's what they were like. That was the joy of writing this book. And I host. I'm sorry, I'm not giving you any time to get a question in here.
That's okay.
I host. I have the honor and the privilege of hosting our school's Remembrance Day ceremony every year.
Mm-hmm.
And this year's ceremony at the end of last week was the theme was youth and remembrance.
Yeah.
And instead of bringing a lot of older veterans back to present in front of the students, I brought a bunch of kids that are in there. One was a 19-year-old tanker.
Mm-hmm.
And she got her hands on her first tank when she was 18.
Oh my gosh.
And so I had one from the Army, one from the Royal Canadian Air Force, and one from the Navy. And the idea was to have these kids understand, and that's what Sprague is all about, is to have people understand that their grandfathers and their uncles and great uncles, they were just kids. They were teenagers. They were nuts. They were goofy and
They were
learning
just
to
like
just,
you.
Yeah, and they were just like you are today. They were just nuts.
Hmm.
And anyway, sorry, I get very excited
No, 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 no,
about the
no, no,
subject.
not at all. You see, my vision is pretty much the same as yours. You've got to get out of you've got to get the history out of history books, if that makes any sense. You've got to, it's about the
Oh, you
people.
mean
It's not,
draw it out?
yeah.
Yeah,
And the history was made by people just doing their best in a
sure.
bad time. And
And and that's absolutely true. And I'm working on another project right now as well that I've discovered a few other people are doing it. I don't know if there must be somebody doing it in the States. I went to a high school called East York Collegiate here
hmm
in Toronto. There were 125 young men from East York Collegiate who gave their lives in the Second World War, and they
hmm
are on a bronze plaque in the school by the lobby, right? And I have always been fascinated by the names on them
hmm
because we tend to, I think, when we're doing Memorial Day and Veterans Day and that sort of thing, we tend to look at those plaques. And when we say, we will remember them, we tend to think in terms of a plaque with a bunch of names on it. And I was always fascinated as a journalist to know the story behind. So
Sure.
I have taken it upon myself, and I'm also trying to do it for all the Texans who were killed in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I've got 10 of those. But I'm writing and researching historical vignettes for all of those 125 young men. We're coming
hmm
up on 30 now. My high school's 100th anniversary is 2027, and I'm going to have them all. I'm determined to have them all finished by the time we get to the 100th anniversary. It's sort of like my gift to the high school. But
Malcolm, I
when you're
think that's
going through
wonderful.
but when you're going through them, you start to realize what they were like,
Hmm.
what their interests were, and who they were, and how they reacted to life, and the stories that were so wonderful. And the one that's so close to me right from the time I was in high school is a guy named Malcolm McIver because of
hmm
the name.
hmm
And he was a member of the 1939 city basketball champions at Easter Collegiate. He was everything you could imagine you would want your son to be. He was the middle boy of three McIver boys, lived locally, just right behind me, actually, in a house that's still there.
hmm
And Malcolm went off, and Malcolm had Hollywood good looks, like he was gorgeous, and he was smart as hell and a great athlete. And the girls just loved him, and he was all the stories about him. He was very sweet. Goes off to war, goes to 106 Squadron early in the war, flies Whitleys as a navigator, wins a DFC, finishes his 30 operations, goes off to teach for 6 months, and they were going to bring him back as a navigator on mosquitoes.
hmm
And he took up a group of other young navigators in an airspeed Oxford, and the aircraft fell out of the sky. And he's buried in England.
hmm
And his younger brother, Jack, joined up in the middle of the war, the RCAF, and Jack was determined he was going to make it into combat. And by that time in the war, the only guarantee you were going to get into combat was to be a gunner, because 6 months and you were out, right?
Yeah.
So he became a gunner, and they sent him to the Far East, and he was a rear gunner on a Liberator
hmm
and an RCAF Liberator. And 2 months before the end of the war in the Pacific, he was shot down, and some of the crew survived, but they were attacking Japanese shipping in the Bay of Bengal,
Yeah.
and he disappeared. So two of the three sons were gone. But you can find these stories. And why is he telling the story? Well, because of this. The eldest son, Glenn, used to be really mad at who survived the war fighting in the Queen's Own Rifles on the ground. He was infantry.
hmm
And before the war, his mom said to him, "Can you go to the store and get some milk and bread?" He said, "Well, why can't Malcolm go? Why do I?" And everybody called Malcolm Mac. Why can't Mac go? Why do I have to go? He never goes.
hmm
And his mother made the mistake of saying, "Well, he's working on his homework and it's very important." So Glenn had had enough. So he picked up a hockey stick and he chased Mac out of the house, down the sidewalk, around the corner, down a little ways into the variety store where he got the milk and bread, and then chased him back again with the hockey stick. And they got into the house and got back in. He puts the stick down and he goes, "Okay, we've got the milk and bread." Perfect brothers. And those are stories that you pick up when you're doing these stories. And I've tried to put so many of these stories into Sprague in my fictional characters.
How in particular do you just have to dig until you find it? I know you said you were a journalist. So
Yeah.
is this a journalistic technique or
Well, I suppose I use my journalistic techniques in doing it, but I don't think you have to be a journalist to
yeah,
do this. But I will tell you the technique that I used and why it took so long. Well, of course, part of it, I mean, obviously, Tom, you know this from writing your own books and your own wonderful library of published work. Um, uh, Life intrudes. So you're running along and you have this other job and your life intrudes. So, you have a death in the family or you just don't feel like it for a few months, right? So these are where some of the delays come in. But the way
right.
I did it was I worked out in my head. I didn't even write it down. I worked out in my head what was going to happen in that chapter. And then I went out and I researched the hell out of it. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the research for the chapter could take a year or more.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would sit down and write the chapter and I could bang the chapter off in 2 weeks. And then
Yeah,
you'd go to the next chapter.
yeah.
So the whole thing is research chapter, research chapter,
Mhm.
research chapter, research chapter. And so that's really how it comes. And that's why all four of my mentors on the book are gone now, because I would do the research, meet the guy. He would become my mentor on the chapter or two chapters. I would really get to know him well. Then we would unfortunately lose him. And we lost Bob last October 13th in
Mm.
2021 at the age of 99.
That's a ripe old age.
He was the house that he built for his family with his own hands, he and his father after the war. He was still living in the house by himself. And I like to say, and the family doesn't mind when I say this, he died with his boots on. He was doing his laundry. And suddenly he didn't feel well. They took him to the hospital, and 4 days later he was gone.
Yeah.
But he was 99 years old, just sharp as a tack the entire time, still doing all of his own work, cooking all of his own meals. But finally his body just went, "You know what, Bob? That's enough."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Time to go to the hangar.
yeah.
But that's just remarkable. And these older gentlemen who are like that are just treasures. And it's a shame that they're not paid more attention to, really.
My best friend is a guy named Ted Barris, Barris. Ted is Canada's most well-known, most successful military nonfiction writer. And Ted's father, and you probably know this, but Ted's father won a Bronze Cross as a medic in the Battle of the Bulge,
Hmm.
and he was from New York. And it was very difficult for medics to earn any medals. They just weren't given the medals.
Mm-hmm.
But Ted and his family moved to Canada, and Ted came along. But he's written 19 best-selling books. And one of his 20th just came out.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Battle of the Atlantic.
Okay.
And he's written on the Canadians in the Dam Busters raid. There were 41 of them. And yeah,
Wow.
and Canadians in the Great Escape and that sort of stuff. But he has found over the years, and I have found, and both my parents were World War II veterans. Both, I like to say, were combat veterans, because my father was one of the famous 47 survivors of the Battle of Calais,
Oh,
and my
wow.
mother had her house blitzed out around her in Bristol in November 1940 by the Luftwaffe, while
Yeah.
she and my grandmother were hiding under the stairs. So the only thing left in the house was the stairs.
Oh, my.
So you think about how close that was, but they didn't, as you know, and we all know, they didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it was only later in their life, when they would pass into their 80s, that they realized that we better start talking about it. We better start telling people so that our grandkids know and people know. And that's how, Ted was able to write so many of his books, because they were ready to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And Ted's father never spoke to him about it. The only thing that Ted's dad, and so many of the listeners to this will understand this. Ted's dad would talk about the fun things. My dad would talk about the fun things. And he was in the British Army for 25 years as a military musician, and a brilliant one. He played at Princess Elizabeth's wedding. So he would talk about things like cheating at cribbage. Like he taught me how to cheat at cribbage, and he taught me how to cheat at dominoes. He also taught me not to gamble, because when I was a teenager, he used to give me my allowance and then take it back, playing dominoes for money. Right. And I
Yeah,
learned not
sure.
to gamble
Uh-huh.
because of that, so I don't gamble. Um, and some might think that's mean, but I certainly learned the lesson. And he was cheating me the whole time. And then when I got into my 20s, he taught me how he was cheating. And it's actually ridiculously easy to cheat at dominoes. But that's what they want to talk about. They wouldn't talk about the bad stuff, and it was only when they were later. And some of the airmen that I talked to, they would talk about it
Mm-hmm.
later. But
Oh,
Bob didn't have anything to say, because Bob's crew, 33 missions,
mhm.
untouched. The
Wow.
only thing that happened to them was a piece of flak came through the top of the Lancaster and landed on Bob's chair while he was not in it, because he was being a nosy navigator over the target.
Man. Now that's luck.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, and that's the luck of combat.
well, you're right when you say it's um Stephen King, the horror writer, has a thing about being able to put your hand on the corpse, figuratively speaking. And that's really, I think, the kind of thing you're talking about. Um, and have you ever read anything by a guy named Jean Amery? He was an
I
Auschwitz survivor.
No, I have not. I've read huge amounts of stuff from Holocaust survivors, but I have not read his. No.
Mr. Amery, I should say probably Monsieur Amery, his point of view was that if he could actually tell you what it was like, he would be inflicting the experience on you. And
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm not sure that anybody could tell you what it was like. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. I'll look up some of his work.
mm-hmm,
But I'll tell you one of the reasons why about my writing. Even in my sports writing, I've always been a very what they refer to as a sensual writer.
mm-hmm.
It's not sexual, that's
Five
sensual.
senses. Yeah.
The five senses. And the one thing, and I remember talking to a student I had of mine, a grad student I had of mine about 10 years ago, who had lived through the breakup of Yugoslavia. So had lived through the war between the Serbs and the Croats. And we were talking about it, and we were talking actually in class about it. And I was asking her, well, what does it look like? And she was explaining. And I said, well, what does it sound like? And she was explaining. She had no problem with this. She wanted to share. And, so we went through the senses. And the last one I picked was, what does it smell like? What does war smell like? And she burst into tears.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that we can never know. And Peter Caddick Adams, who's a famous British historical writer,
Mm-hmm.
he's just written a new book about the last 100 days in the West. And he's talking about the British when the British went into Bergen-Belsen.
Mm-hmm.
And the writer, the British doctor who was trying to explain what it smelled like. And this is a hugely educated man who was an amazing man of letters, could
Hmm.
not explain it. There's no way to explain what combat smells like. And that's why I think that's when veterans say, and you say, well, what's combat really like? When they say you have to be there. I think that's what they really mean.
Hmm. There are some things you simply can't put into words.
You just can't. You can't describe it.
Hmm.
It's like World War I veterans trying to describe no man's land.
Oh God.
It's
Yeah.
indescribable.
Yeah.
You can't describe what that is actually like. And I have a particular interest because of my mother's experiences in the Blitz on Britain in 1940 and 1941. And that's again, when you read all these amazing writers, you think about not just the British writers, but all the amazing American writers that
Hmm.
were over there.
Hmm.
I suppose most famous of which would be Edward R. Murrow.
Hmm.
But and you think about them and Quentin Reynolds and people like that, Larry LaRue, they would say that, look, there's certain things we just can't explain to you because you
Hmm.
have to be there. There's just no way to do it. So that's part of the problem, of course, going back to what you said about not being able to write fiction anymore. You do, I guess, you know, have to have been there. But if that were completely true, you and I, Tom, would be out of a job.
That's true.
But all we can do is try our best through the eyes of those who were actually there. But we'll
Hmm.
never be able to get that fifth sense. We just won't.
Right.
A historical novel cannot be scratch and sniff. Like and I mean that quite sincerely. I know
Oh,
it
no,
comes
no.
across funny,
Hmm.
but I mean that sincerely. That's something we will never have. And even today, with the boys and girls who are coming back, God, I feel old. With the boys and girls who are coming back from Iraq, and for our guys coming and girls coming back from Afghanistan,
Hmm.
they'll never be able to explain it. How do you explain an IUD going off?
Yeah.
That's not an I think an IUV going off. We're gonna,
Yeah.
but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
But
And
how do you explain that? You can't explain it.
you can take all of your invention, and I flatter myself that I have some modicum of that, and you do too. But you can take all of that, and you're still going to fall short. But that's okay. I think it's the effort that's important. The
And
idea
I
that you're
agree.
keeping something alive that is going to be lost otherwise.
Can
And
I tell you a ghost story?
oh, by all means, please do.
Sprague started with me. I was originally going to have Sprague go to 419 Squadron when they had switched to Lanks.
Hmm.
But now when they go to Middleton St. George, they go when they're still on Halifaxes.
Hmm.
There is only one legitimate Halifax bomber in the world. The
Hmm.
one that's in England is put together from pieces of here, there, and a couple of post-war models and that stuff.
Hmm.
But here in Ontario, in a place called Trenton, which is where the National Air Museum is at Trenton Air Base. It's humongous air base.
Hmm.
They have a Halifax they pulled off at the bottom of a Norwegian lake in 2001, I think it was. And then it took them 9 years to put her back together, but she came up almost intact,
Hmm.
missing the tail, and they did find the tail eventually. The only thing that was missing was a little bit of the rear fuselage. And
Hmm.
they found, because the Halifax was built in pieces, like the Lank,
Yeah.
one company builds this part, one company builds this part, and then they bring them all together and put them together, right?
Yeah.
So they found the missing piece of fuselage, one of them in northern Scotland, being used since the war as a chicken coop, and still in great shape. So they bought it and brought it back. But I was given the opportunity to sit in the Halifax and sit in the pilot seat just after she had first been shown in
Hmm.
2006. by a guy who died in 2009, who was one of the guys in charge of putting her back together. And he was off in the other part of the plane, and I was sitting in the pilot seat. He had I can start a Halifax if we ever had one that can start, because he taught me how to do it. I need someone behind me in the engineers thing to press the
Right.
buttons, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Start number one. But I can start one. But I'm sitting there and I'm taking all these notes, and suddenly I heard a voice. And the voice said, "Tell our story correctly." Because when that Halifax crashed on the lake in the winter, 6 of the 7 guys died of exposure.
Yeah.
I was sitting in the pilot seat of a guy who had died of exposure. And that's the voice I heard. And whether that was just me with not enough sleep, I don't know if you believe in these things or anybody does, but I believe I heard that voice. And that's what I have done. I have tried everything that I can. I have delayed the book and done all the things to do to tell the story as close I can to directly. And Bob wrote for me for the back of the book. Bob wrote, and I quote, "It's remarkable that someone who did not live in that time has been able to recreate our lives as airmen in the Second World War in such detail." And Bob said before he died, he said, "Malcolm, the book reads like an autobiography." And I gave him a big hug. We were both masked, and because it was COVID.
Sure.
And I said, "Bob, so much of that is because of you, because you made sure that each step of the way, if there was an error, I fixed it." And he told me all the stories and all the things, and taught me all the dirty songs, and
Ah,
and
but that's part of it.
yeah,
And
boy, there's a lot of dirty songs. Holy cow!
oh, I bet. I bet. But
Well, but
you
yeah,
really can't ask for better than that.
no, you can't.
And for a writer, especially for the kind of work we do, for somebody to tell you that is don't get me wrong, I like the money, but oh my God, for someone
Yeah.
to tell you that is just that literally makes it all worthwhile. It just can't be beat.
And somebody read the book. One of the very first readers of the book goes through Sprague, and I got a note. Said, "I love your book, but gee, there's an awful lot of F words in it." And I instead of saying, "Oh, I'm not going to," I sent him a note back and I explained. These were kids going off to war. And when they
Mhm.
joined the Air Force or the Navy, the Army, they needed right away to be able to feel as though they were all grown up.
Mhm.
So the F word came out. And all
Mhm.
the airmen told me this, but you read about this all the time. But the F word came out,
Mhm.
and a lot. And they learned to use it as a noun and a verb and an adverb and an adjective,
Punctuation.
a punctuation and a subjective completion.
Mhm.
That effing little fucker. And
It's historical.
it's historical. Bob tells this amazing story that I heard from some other airmen as well. He gets home safely. His mom was a Christian Scientist, so
Mhm.
pretty serious.
Oh
And
boy, yeah.
he gets home to Toronto after the war, and he's safe and all of that sort of stuff. And he and his future wife were engaged, but they weren't living in the same place, obviously, because of the time. So he's upstairs in his old bedroom, and it's his first night. And for weeks, he'd been saying to himself, "Whatever you do, when you go home, don't use the F word in front of your mother," right? And he has like said this like for 3 weeks. He's been telling himself, "Don't do this." So he smells dinner and goes down the stairs, goes into the kitchen. He says, "Hey, Mom, what the fuck's for dinner?" And Bob told me that his mother looked at him with the finger and said, "I don't care if you're an Air Force hero or not. You will not use that language in my house."
All right. Go, mom.
Bob Bob was home.
And I bet he loved that.
Oh yeah, that was one of his favorite stories, and he had so many stories to tell, but it was one of his favorite stories. And
John Hersey made kind of the
yes,
same
of course,
point.
yeah, yeah.
Um, he wrote about if you were going to write authentic dialogue in a war story from World War II, you did face that problem. Exactly like you said, they learned to use the F word as all parts of speech. And I had a experience one time. I had written a story like that, a short story, and the instructor invited me to read in front of the classroom. And I suddenly realized as I got there that here are all these older, very proper ladies that were part of our writers group at the time. And I did the fastest bit of editing you ever heard of in your life on the fly. And my
I
instructor's
might
up
have
there
actually just
laughing
stood
at
up
me.
and said, "Look, if I'm going to read this, you have to understand that the language is part of who they were."
Yeah, and I probably
Right?
should have done that,
Yeah, and because and it's one of those things you don't think about at the time because you're going, oh, I don't forget. But when you think about it afterwards, and probably the next time that that comes up is a situation that you can say to people, I want you to understand that this is part of who they were. And if
hmm
it's all right with you, I'm going to use the language the way it was. And
hmm
there are other things that as writers we're going to have a problem with.
right,
Telling the Jackie Robinson story as we move along is going to become more and more of a problem from, speaking as a sports historian,
sure.
right? Because there are certain language that people aren't going to want to use. But how can you possibly tell the story without and
But it's
explain the terrible things that Jackie went through, the awful stuff he had to overcome, why he is such a hero, without being able to explain the way it really was.
Guy
And
Gibson's dog.
yes, now that's funny you should mention him because it's important to understand for Americans that in Britain at the time there was nothing meant by that. Okay. And for those who are unaware what we're talking about, Guy Gibson's dog was named the N-word.
Right.
But in Britain, there was no understanding or context or historical background of that word that
hmm
made the word bad in the way that it was absolutely wrong for anybody from North America to use.
Right.
Right.
hmm
Um, and for an example, when you were coming into the pundits, of course, were the flashing lights around each of the airfields that flashed
hmm
out whatever that day's two-letter code was, so you could tell which airport. And what you would say is darky, darky, darky. I'm coming in.
Right.
So nothing really was meant by it. So when they made the dam busters, when the British made the dam busters in 1957, there was nothing meant by it. It wasn't meant to be pejorative,
hmm
but you can't do it now. And when there was this big thing, help me out here with the guy who made Lord of the Rings, Peter
Peter
Jackson,
Jackson. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When Peter Jackson was thinking of making the Dam
The remake.
Buster,
Yeah.
the weirdest thing suddenly got caught. They got caught up in the weirdest thing, like on Twitter and Facebook and stuff. It's not right that we don't use the name of the dog, or how are they going to use the name of the dog, or do they rename the dog? And I got pretty quickly upset about the thing, and I said, "Look, guys, this is a silly discussion. All you say is, 'Hey, boy, come here, boy. Come on, boy,
hmm
let's go hunt rabbits.' Like, this is not the
hmm
biggest thing we should be talking about."
hmm
But you can't, when they show um, dam busters, which they do about 83 times a year on British television,
Yeah.
uh, they um, they bleep it out.
Really.
Yes.
Hmm.
And but I'm okay with that because it's part of the modern sensibility. Our
hmm
sensibilities have changed, our understanding of things have changed, and it would be way too difficult to stop the film every time that happened and have a discussion about how back in my parents' time, and
hmm
my dad was born in 1918 and my mother was born in 1922, in Britain specifically, I'm not talking about the United States,
Right.
but in Britain specifically, um, it was It wasn't meant to be anything,
as a
anything
derogatory sense.
insulting or derogatory, or to have any contextual understanding of slavery or the antebellum South.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's why, for an example, that, and this is something that's going to wind up in Sprague book 4, because of a character, it's why in Britain the happiest times that our Black troops had sometimes in their lives is when they went to Britain,
Mm-hmm.
and they were treated like everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
and they could go to the pubs with no problem, and they could dance with whoever they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it was only when the American forces started to really come in that they literally had to set nights in the British pubs. And the British, the Tuesday and Thursday and Sunday were for Black troops, and in areas where there are large numbers of Black troops. And for those of us who were British, my parents, for an example, they couldn't understand it. They had no understanding or background idea of what the context was, or why this should be a problem, right? And it's
Oh, now, if you
yeah,
want
but
to
it's
have a chapter and verse discussion on that one, I was born in Rome, Georgia. So,
yes. Well, see, and again, but I
yeah.
mean, but can you imagine somebody who was brought up in Rome, Georgia, who was born in 1920,
Mm-hmm.
and finds himself in Britain and I'm gonna touch. I'm damn it, I'm gonna do this in book 4, even though people have said to me, I'm not really sure you should touch that story. No, I'm gonna do it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine somebody who's brought up to believe these crazy things that they were brought up to believe through no fault of their own, because kids are
Mm-hmm.
just kids, and they learn to hate because they're taught hate. How do we
Mm-hmm.
get on this subject? And
I don't know.
I don't
Oh,
know.
the
How do
F
we get
word.
here?
That's what.
Yeah, that's probably what it was. How difficult that must have been for them to get to Britain and discover all of a sudden that there was no separation.
Well, the interesting thing is, I mentioned Neville Shute in the pre-interview, but he
Yeah.
wrote a book called The Checkerboard, I think it was. And there's a line of narrative in that which deals with that very subject, Black servicemen in England during the war. And I'm sorry, my cat's sitting here
Hi, Kitty.
scratching away at something she's not supposed to scratch at.
Oh,
Well, speaking
there
of
she is.
which,
Hi,
yeah.
Kitty.
Mm-hmm.
But
So,
that is that it's it, to bring it back to where we were.
mm-hmm.
There is an important scene in the early part of Sprague where two guys from Texas are having a conversation, and a couple of other guys from the States come up to them and say, look, and they will have this discussion. And the discussion is because there are Black airmen
Mm-hmm.
here at number 1 Manning Depot.
Mm-hmm.
And this is so new to them, they don't even know what to do. So they come up to the two Texas guys and they have this discussion about, is there anything we can do? And you'll see when you read the book how it all works itself out. But then when it works itself out, one of the Canadian guys comes up to the guy from Texas and says, I'm very proud of you, and blah, blah, blah. And the Texan looks at him and says, you have no idea what just happened there. And you don't have a right to talk, because since we've been here in Canada, we have noticed that you guys have your own problems
Hmm.
with racism,
Yeah.
right? And I wanted to touch on that.
Mm-hmm.
That it's very easy to feel as though you're better than other people, you're holier than thou, when you don't look around at the problems in your own country.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had great feedback on that scene for people saying, that's right. That kid didn't have a right to feel superior, to feel holier than thou because of what he just heard. Because he was surrounded by his own problems, that because he grew up in it, he didn't realize it was a problem. So you try to work that all in, and you try to do it without trying to do it, which is a ridiculous thing to say. I
No,
mean, I'm
actually,
not,
that's a good way to put it.
I'm not going out of my way to make these points. The points just happen naturally in the story because of and you go and you do your research and you hear that this is what happened and blah blah blah. So you just oh, I'll use that, and then you use it, and the story comes out.
Yeah.
You
But
know.
I think that's a good point, Malcolm. I'm going to look forward to reading that.
Thank you.
So,
But we didn't. The Royal Canadian Air Force. They talk about the Tuskegee Airmen and all of that sort of stuff. And I guess it was that the 342nd fighter group.
I think so.
The Red Tails.
Yeah.
But they weren't allowed to start to learn to fly until early 1943, I guess it was.
Yeah.
But you know what? You couldn't get into the Royal Canadian Air Force if you were black until early 1943. The blacks who were there had come from other countries. They had come from the Caribbean, especially.
Right.
The Royal Air Force has an incredible background of allowing Sikhs and South Asians, Indians, to come and fly with them. But the Royal Canadian Air Force, oh yeah, Canada, they wouldn't take Canadian blacks from Canada until early 43. So who did we, who were we to sort of stand there and be holier than thou with anyone else?
It never makes any sense, does it?
No.
When you really step back and think about it. I always think about the Star Trek episode, the one where the two guys have been chasing each other for thousands of years because one is black on the wrong side of his face and white on the other.
Frank Gorshin.
Yeah. A great actor. But yeah. Well, we need to end this up. I'm a little worried. We're running a little tight. The book is Sprague by Malcolm Kelly. And Malcolm, you have others in the work. I believe you mentioned that you're going to do at least 5.
Well, book 2 is supposed to come out, I'm hoping comes out January 24. It's about 75% finished now.
Okay.
Sprague is available everywhere you get in the United States. Sprague is available everywhere you get books online.
I can attest to it. It's in my library.
Yes, including Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all of that sort of thing. If you're watching this in Canada, it's available at Chapters Indigo stores and online, or at your local bookshop. And if you're watching in England, this is available, and in Britain, it's available on Waterstone's website. And if you're in Yorkshire, you can get it at a Waterstone store. So,
okay. Well, that's excellent. And I think that'll do it for today. Malcolm, look, I've enjoyed this immensely. And if you can't tell, I'll just tell you straight. It was fun. Yeah. Hang on just a second. And